أهلا بيك عزيزي المشاهد. النهاردة هنسمع اختبار من أعظم الاختبارات، وهو اختبار العالم الكبير فرانسيس كولينز. كمل معانا بعد الفاصل. عزيزي المشاهد، لعلك تساءلت مين هو فرانسيس كولينز؟ فرانسيس كولينز هو عالم الجينات وعلم الوراثة ورائد مشروع الجينوم البشري، وأكيد سمعتم عن أهمية هذا المشروع طبعا. وبيعمل حاليا كمدير لمعاهد الصحة الوطنية الأمريكية، وعينه بندكت السادس عشر مدير للمعهد البابوي للعلوم. فهو حاصل على العديد من الجوائز العلمية، فهو يعتبر من أشهر علماء العالم اللي تحولوا من الالحاد إلى المسيحية، وجال عبارته المشهورة: بصفتي مدير مشروع الجينوم البشري قدت مجموعة من العلماء لقراءة 3 مليار وواحد من 10 حرف في الجينوم البشري، كتاب التعليمات الجيني الخاص بينا. كمؤمن أرى الحمض النووي الجزيئية المعلوماتية لكل الكائنات الحية، وأراه كلغة الإله. التمييز والتعقيد في السمنة وفي الطبيعة انعكاس لخطة الإله. كتب فرانسيس كتاب رائع اسمه لغة الإله، اتكلم فيه عن نشأته من أسرة ملحدة، وعن كفاحه العلمي وعمله كطبيب، وازاي اتأثر جدا من مريضة عنده كانت على وشك الموت، جواها ثقة واطمئنان عجيب في مصيرها الأبدي، وتساءل إذا كان الثقة والإيمان ده مش حقيقي، فازاي لديهم القدرة على طمأنة المريض بهذا الشكل؟ وتخيل نفسه في موقف هذه السيدة مقبل على الموت، بالتأكيد ما كانش هيبقى في سلام وطمأنينة زيها.
Story, but they did. I arrived in medical school as an atheist, but it didn't last, because in that third year of medical school, I found myself, as one does, taking care of patients. Wonderful people with terrible illnesses. Illnesses that medicine was not going to be able to solve in many instances. People who saw the approach of death, knowing what was coming, and to my surprise, seemed to be at peace about it because of their faith. That was puzzling. And as I tried to imagine myself in that situation, I knew I would not be at peace. I would be terrified. And that was a bit disturbing, but I tried to put it out of my mind until one afternoon when a wonderful elderly woman who was my patient, who had very advanced heart disease that we had run out of options for and who knew her life was coming to a close, told me in a very simple, sincere way about her faith and how that gave her courage and hope and peace about what was coming. And as she finished that description, she looked at me sort of quizzically as I sat there silently, feeling a little embarrassed, and she said, "Doctor, I've told you about my faith, and we've talked about my family, and I thought maybe you might say something." Oh. And then she asked me the most simple question. "Doctor, what do you believe?" Nobody had ever asked me that question before, not like that, not in such a simple, sincere way. And I realized I didn't know the answer. I felt uneasy. I could feel my face flushing. I wanted to get out of there. The ice was cracking under my feet. Everything was all of a sudden muddled by this simple question: "Doctor, what do you believe?" So that troubled me, and I thought about it a little bit and realized what the problem was. I was a scientist, or at least I thought I was, and scientists are supposed to make decisions after they look at the data, after they look at the evidence. I had made a decision that there was no God, and I'd never really thought about looking at the evidence. That didn't seem like a good thing. It was the decision that I wanted the answer to be, but I had to admit I didn't really know whether I had chosen the answer on the basis of reason or whether because it was a convenient form of perhaps willful blindness to the evidence. I wasn't sure there was any evidence, but I figured I'd better go find out because I didn't want to be in that spot again. So what did I do? Well, I figured there are those world religions. What do they believe? I better find out. And I tried to read through some of those sacred texts, and I got totally confused and frustrated. And there was no Wikipedia to help me either. It's much easier now.
واتفجر عنده التفكير والحيرة لما سألته هذه السيدة عن إيمانه. الحقيقة أنه مهما كان الإنسان متغافل عن البحث عن الحقيقة لازم يدور عليها لما يكون في مواجهة الموت.
I mean, there are all sorts of ways that one might come face to face with this question of is there a God? But a particularly interesting one is sitting at the bedside of someone who is facing death and imagining yourself in that position. And I couldn't help but think, I don't want to be in that position and not have some better sense of the answer. You know, when you're young, you can imagine for the longest time that you're immortal. But when you're a medical student facing death every day on the wards, it's pretty hard. And that's really what happened to me that afternoon. A combination of realizing I hadn't done the hard work that I should to answer a really important question, and a realization that my life was not going to go on forever. And Billy Graham once talking to somebody about faith had the response coming back from that young person, well, you know, I've got a long time to live. I'm the sort of person who doesn't study during the course. I wait and then I cram for exams. To which Billy Graham responded, gee, I hope you don't get a pop quiz. Thinking about that, there in my 26th year sitting at the bedside of this wonderful, kindly, spiritual woman, without realizing it in quite those terms, I think the pop quiz possibility may have crossed my consciousness, and I realized this is not something to put off. This is one of those questions that sooner or later you're going to have to address, and to pretend you've addressed it already is clearly not defensible. You've never given any serious consideration to the possibility that faith might be real.
وبيحكي البروفيسور بعد كده عن ذهابه لمبشر وسؤاله عن كل المشكلات الإيمانية في ذهنه، لكن المبشر ده أعطاله كتاب لعالم ملحد اسمه لويس آمن بالمسيح بيجيب على كل أسئلته، لأنه تقريبا كان بيعاني من نفس الإشكاليات. وبعد ذهابه للبيت وقراءته لأول صفحات هذا الكتاب أدرك من أول لحظة أن شكوكه واعتراضاته على الإيمان وهمية وغير حقيقية.
So at a loss, I knocked on the door of a minister who lived down the road from me in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and said, I don't know what these people are talking about, but I figure it's time for me to learn. So, okay, you must be a believer, at least I hope you are, you're a minister. Let me ask you some questions. So I asked him a bunch of probably blasphemous questions, and he was gracious about that. And after a while said, you know, you're on a journey here trying to figure out what's true. You're not the first one. And in fact, I've got a book here written by somebody who went on that same journey from an academic perspective. In fact, it was a pretty distinguished Oxford scholar. He found around him there were people who were believers, and he was puzzled about that, and he set about to try to figure out why people believe, and figured that he could shoot them down. And, well, why don't you read the book and see what happened? So he pulled this little book off the shelf, and I took it home and began to read. And in the first 2 or 3 pages, I realized that my arguments against faith were really those of a schoolboy. They had no real substance. And the thoughtful reflections of this Oxford scholar, whose name, of course, is C.S. Lewis, made me realize there was a great depth of thinking and reason that could be applied to the question of God. And that was a surprise. I had imagined faith and reason were at opposite poles. And here was this deep intellectual who is convincing me quickly, page by page, that actually reason and faith go hand in hand, though faith has the added component of revelation. Well, I had to learn more about that. Over the course of the next year, kicking and screaming most of the way, because I did not want this to turn out the way that it seemed to be turning out, I began to realize that the evidence for the existence of God, while not proof, was actually pretty interesting. And it certainly made me realize that atheism would no longer be for me an acceptable choice, that it was the least rational of the options.
وابتدى فرانسيس يلخص الحجج العلمية والمنطقية اللي أقنعته بالإيمان، وهم من 3 حجج رئيسية كالآتي: أولا الانفجار الكبير وبداية الكون، ثانيا حجة الضبط الدقيق للكون، ثالثا القانون الأخلاقي اللي وضعه الله في البشر. وفند حججه بالتفصيل كالآتي: أولا الانفجار الكبير.
But let me summarize for you the kinds of arguments that ultimately brought me around to the position of recognizing that belief in God was an entirely satisfying intellectually event, but also something that I was increasingly discovering I had a spiritual hunger for. And interestingly, some of the pointers to God had been in front of me all along, coming from the study of nature, and I hadn't really thought about them, but here they were. Here's one which seems like an obvious statement, but maybe it's not so obvious. There is something instead of nothing. No reason that should be. This phrase of Wigner, the Nobel laureate in physics, caught my eye because I had been involved, of course, as a graduate student working with quantum mechanics with Schrödinger's equation. And one of the things that had appealed to me so much about mathematics and physics and chemistry was how it was that this particular kind of depiction of matter and energy works. I mean, it really works well. And a theory that is correct often turns out to be simple and beautiful. And why should that be? Why should mathematics be so unreasonably effective in describing nature? There's the Big Bang. The fact that the universe had a beginning, as virtually all scientists are now coming to the conclusion, about 13.7 billion years ago, in an unimaginable singularity, where the universe, smaller than a golf ball, suddenly appeared and then began flying apart and has been flying apart ever since. And we can calculate that singularity by noticing just how far those galaxies are receding from us and things like the background microwave radiation, the echo of that Big Bang. And of course that presents a difficulty because our science cannot look back beyond that point. And it seems that something came out of nothing. Well, nature isn't supposed to allow that. So if nature is not able to create itself, how did the universe get here? You can't postulate that that was created by some natural force or you haven't solved the problem, because then, okay, what created that natural force? So the only plausible, it seemed to me, explanation is that there must be some supernatural force that did the creating. And of course, that force would not need to be limited by space or even by time. Oh, now we're getting somewhere. So, all right, let's imagine there is a creator, let's call that creator God, who is supernatural, who's not bounded by space, not bounded by time, and is a pretty darn good mathematician. And it's starting to make some sense here. Well, God must also be an incredible physicist, because another thing I began to realize.
ثانيا حجة الضبط الدقيق للكون والضوابط الفيزيائية اللي سمحت بوجود الحياة ووضحها كالآتي.
Well, God must also be an incredible physicist, because another thing I began to realize by a little more reading is that there is this phenomenal fine-tuning of the universe that makes complexity and therefore life possible. Those of you who study physics and chemistry will know that there's a whole series of laws that govern the behavior of matter and energy. They are simple, beautiful equations, but they have constants in them, like the gravitational constant or the speed of light. And you cannot derive at the present time the value of those constants. They are what they are. They're givens. You have to do the experiment and measure them. Well, suppose they were a little different. Would that matter? Would anything change in our universe if the gravitational constant was a little stronger or a little weaker? Some days I think it's a little stronger, but I don't think it really is. So that calculation got done, particularly in the 1970s, by Barrow and Tipler. And the answer was astounding, that if you take any of these 15 constants and you tweak them just a tiny little bit, the whole thing doesn't work anymore. Take gravity, for instance. If gravity was just 1 part in about 10 billion weaker than it actually is, then after the Big Bang, there would be insufficient gravitational pull to result in the coalescence of stars and galaxies and planets and you and me. And you'd end up, therefore, with an infinitely expanding sterile universe. If gravity was just a tiny bit stronger, well, things would coalesce all right, but a little too soon. And the Big Bang would be followed after a while by a big crunch, and we would not have the chance to appear because the timing wouldn't be right. And that's just one example. You can't look at that data and not marvel at it. It is astounding to see the knife edge of improbability upon which our existence exists. So what's that about? Well, I can think of three possibilities. First of all, maybe theory will someday tell us that these constants have to have the value they have, that there is some a priori reason for that. Most physicists I talk to don't think that's too likely. There might be relationships between them that have to be maintained, but not the whole thing. A second possibility, perhaps we are one of an almost infinite series of other universes that have different values of those constants, and of course we have to be in the one where everything turned out right or we wouldn't be having this conversation. So that's the multiverse hypothesis, and it is a defensible one as long as you're willing to accept the fact that you will probably never be able to observe those infinite series of other parallel universes. So that requires quite a leap of faith. The third possibility is that this is intentional, that these constants have the value they do because that creator God, who is a good mathematician, also knew that there was an important set of dials to set here if this universe that was coming into being was going to be interesting. So take those three possibilities, and which of them seems most plausible? Apply Occam's razor, if you will, which says that the simplest explanation is most likely correct. Well, I come down on number three, especially because I've already kind of gotten there in terms of the other arguments about the idea of a creator. And this is interesting, but of course,
وضح البروفيسور أن المعطيات العلمية دي ربما توصلوا فقط للربوبية زي ما حصل لأينشتاين، لكن ده ما عجبهوش على الإطلاق. صورة الإله اللي خلق الكون في البداية وتركه وانشغل بشيء آخر ولم يتواصل مع البشر. لكن اللي قاده لإله الأديان هو الحجة الثالثة وهي القانون الأخلاقي للبشر. وضح أن التطور عاجز عن تفسير التضحية والإثارة عند البشر، فالجين الأناني مش هيخلي البشر يضحوا بحياتهم من أجل الغير. وأعطى البروفيسور بعض الأمثلة القوية لتضحيات البشر زي الأم تريزا وعطائها للمرضى والمشرفين على الموت وفقرها الاختياري اللي بيتعارض مع الثقافة المادية السائدة في العصر، وأوسكار شيلندر اللي عرض حياته للخطر نتيجة إيوائه لأكثر من 1000 يهودي أثناء بحث النازيين عنهم في الحرب العالمية الثانية.
So far, how far have we gotten? We've gotten to Einstein's God now, because Einstein certainly marveled at the way in which mathematics worked. Einstein was not aware, as far as we know, of the fine-tuning arguments at quite this level, but probably would have embraced them in the same way. But we haven't really gotten to a theist God yet. We've gotten to a deist God. So how do we get there? Well, now we come back to Lewis in that first chapter of Mere Christianity, which is called Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And here what is being talked about is the moral law. I didn't take philosophy in college, so I didn't really quite know what this was all about. But as I began to recognize what the argument was, it rang true. It rang true in a really startling way. One of those things where you realize, I've known about this all my life, but I've never really quite thought about it. So what's the argument? The argument is that we humans are unique in the animal kingdom by apparently having a law that we are under, although we seem free to break it because that happens every day. And the law is that there's something called right and there's something called wrong, and we're supposed to do the right thing and not the wrong thing. Again, we break that law. When we do, what do? We make an excuse, which only means we believe the law must be true and we're trying to be let off the hook. Now, people will quickly object, now wait a minute. I can think of human cultures that did terrible things. How can you say they were under the moral law? Well, if you go and study those cultures, you will find out that the things that we consider terrible were in their column called right because of various cultural expectations. So clearly the moral law is universal, but it is influenced in terms of particular actions and how they size up in the right and wrong assessment. Well, the moral law sometimes calls us to do some pretty dramatic things. particularly in terms of altruism, where you do something sacrificial for somebody else. And what about that? People may argue, and they have, and they will continue to, that this can all be explained by evolution, and those are useful arguments to look at. So, for instance, if you're being altruistic to your own family, you can see how that might make sense from an evolutionary perspective, because they share your DNA. So if you're helping their DNA survive, well, it's yours too. And so that makes sense from a Darwinian argument about reproductive fitness. If you are being nice to somebody in expectation they'll be nice to you later, a reciprocal form of altruism, well, okay, you could see how that might also make sense in terms of benefiting your reproductive success. You can even make arguments, as Martin Nowak has at Harvard, that if you do computer modeling of things like the prisoner's dilemma, you can come up with motivations for entire groups to behave altruistically toward each other. But a consequence of that, and all the other models that have been put together, is that you still have to be hostile to people who are not in your group. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart as far as the evolutionary drive for successful competition. Well, does that fit? Is that what we see in our own experience? Where are those circumstances where we think the moral law has been most dramatically at work? I would submit they are not when we're being just nice to our family, or just nice to people who are going to be nice to us, or even just when we're being nice to other people in our own group. The things that strike us, that cause us to marvel and to say, that's what human nobility is all about, are when that radical altruism extends beyond those categories. When you see Mother Teresa and the streets of Calcutta picking up the dying. When you see Oskar Schindler risking his life to save Jews from the Holocaust. When you see the Good Samaritan. Or when you see Wesley Autry. Wesley Autry, a construction worker, African-American, standing on the subway platform in New York City. And next to him, a young man, a graduate student, went into an epileptic seizure. And to the horror of everybody standing there, the student fell onto the tracks in front of an oncoming train. With only a split second to make a decision, Wesley jumped onto the tracks as well, pulled the student, still having the seizure, in that small space in between the tracks, covered him with his own body, and the train rolled over both of them. And miraculously, there was just enough clearance for them both to survive. And here's a picture of the next day, as Wesley describes the situation, standing next to the young man's father. This was clearly radical altruism. These people were of no acquaintance of each other, had no likelihood of seeing each other in any other circumstance, and belonged to different groups as we seem to define them here in our society, one being African American, one being white. And yet, New York went crazy, and they should. What an amazing act. What an amazing, risky thing to do. Now, evolution would say, Wesley, what were you thinking? Talk about ruining your reproductive fitness opportunities. This is a scandal, isn't it? So think about that. Again, I'm not offering you a proof, but I do think when people try to argue that morality can be fully explained on evolutionary grounds, that's a little bit too easy. That's a little bit too much of a just so story. And perhaps it might ought to be thought about as potentially having some other reflected reason for its presence. And I would ask the question, because Lewis asked it in his chapter, if you were looking not just for evidence of a God who was a mathematician and a physicist, but a God who cared about human beings and who stood for what was good and holy and wanted his people to also be interested in what is good and holy, wouldn't it be interesting to find written in your own heart this moral law which doesn't otherwise make sense and which is calling you to do just that? That made a lot of sense to me.
واستنتج البروفيسور من هذا القانون الأخلاقي زي ما ذكر في كتابه صفحة 38 أن هناك قوة تتحكم في الكون من الخارج، وأن هذه القوة لا يمكن أن تظهر كأحد حقائق الكون، كما أنه لا يمكن لمصمم البيت أن يظهر نفسه على شكل الحائط أو المدخنة الموجودة في البيت، لكن الطريقة التي يمكن أن نتوقع أن هذه القوة تظهر نفسها بها هو داخل أنفسنا على شكل تأثير أو أمر يدفعنا للسلوك على نحو معين، وهذا ما نشاهده في ذواتنا أو ما يسمى بالقانون الأخلاقي. وتساءل أيضا في صفحة 48 من كتابه قائلا: لماذا يوجد داخل قلوبنا وعقولنا فراغ إلهي إذ لم يكن هناك ما يشبعه؟ وشرح ذلك قائلا: الكائنات لا تولد برغبات إلا إذا كان ممكنا إشباع هذه الرغبات. الطفل يشعر بالجوع، حسنا هناك شيء اسمه طعام. البطة الصغيرة تريد أن تسبح، حسنا هناك شيء لذلك هو الماء. الرجال لديهم رغبة جنسية، حسنا هناك شيء اسمه جنس. إذا وجدت أن لدي رغبة لا يمكن إشباعها في هذا العالم، فإن التفسير المحتمل جدا أنني خلقت لعالم آخر. هل يمكن لهذا الشوق نحو المقدس الكوني المحير بالنسبة للتجربة الإنسانية ألا يكون مشبعا لرغبات، وإنما مؤشر باتجاه شيء خارج ذواتنا؟ لماذا يوجد داخل قلوبنا وعقولنا فراغ إلهي؟ واعتبر هذه الأشواق نحو الله شبيهة بالقانون الأخلاقي، يعني شيء وضع الله في نفوسنا البشرية للتعرف عليه، وده جاله في صفحة 47 من كتابه. وتساءل أيضا في صفحة 38 من كتابه قائلا: إذا كان ذلك صحيحا، ما نوع هذا الإله؟ هل هو الإله الربوبي؟ هل هو الذي خلق الفيزياء والرياضيات وبدأ تحريك الكون قبل 14 مليون سنة، ثم قرر أن يتعامل مع الكائنات الأخرى باعتبارها كائنات أكثر أهمية كما يقول أينشتاين؟ لا، هذا الإله إذا كنت قد أدركته حقا يجب أن يكون إله الإيمان الذي يرغب بنوع من العلاقة مع هذه الكائنات المتميزة التي تسمى بشر، والتي تبعا لذلك غرس فيها لمحة في كل واحد منا. قد يكون هو إله إبراهيمي، ولكنه بالتأكيد ليس إله أينشتاين. وتعرض أيضا في كتابه صفحة 50 لبعض المشكلات اللي واجهته مع الإيمان بإله إبراهيم، ومن ضمنها الشرور التي حدثت باسم الدين. وكانت حجته في الرد عليها هي أن التعليم الديني المسيحي مثل الماء النقي، ولكن العيب في الأواني الفاسدة التي حملت الماء داخلها. فالمسيح لم يأمر بالحروب الصليبية ولا بمحاكم التفتيش، لكن البشر هم من شوهوا صورة الدين بأفعالهم السيئة. أما تعليم الدين فهي نقية مثل الماء الطاهر لا يلوثها شيء. وتعرض أيضا في كتابه صفحة 53 لمشكلة الألم في العالم، وكانت حجته في الرد عليها هي أن قسما كبيرا من معاناتنا وألمنا هو بسبب ما نقوم به تجاه بعضنا البعض. فالبشرية هي من صنعت السكاكين والسهام والمسدسات والقنابل وكل أدوات التعذيب، فمن الصعب جدا تحميل الإله نتائج أفعالنا. وضرب مثال لذلك ابنته الجميلة اللي اغتصبها شخص ملثم وتركها متألمة لسنوات طويلة وهي محطمة. فمن الصعب أن نلوم الله على جرائم البشر، بل ينبغي أن نحصل منه على شفاء نفوسنا الجريحة. وتساءل ساخرا: هل ينبغي على الله أن يقيد حريتنا من أجل أن يمنع حدوث مثل هذه السلوكيات الشريرة؟ وتطرق في صفحة 58 من كتابه والمشكلة أخرى قابلته، وهي كيف الإنسان عقلاني أن يؤمن بالمعجزات وهذا يتعارض مع كونه عالم. وجال في صفحة 64: لا تشكل المعاجز تعارضا غير قابل للتوفيق. فبالنسبة للشخص المؤمن الذي يثق بالعلم كوسيلة لاستقراء عالم الطبيعة وبأن العالم محكوم بقوانين، فإن كنت مثلي تؤمن بوجود شيء ما خارج هذا العالم، فإنه لا يوجد سبب منطقي يمنع من قيام هذه القوة بالتدخل في حالات نادرة. ولكن حتى نتجنب غرق العالم في حالة من الفوضى، يجب أن تكون هذه المعاجز نادرة الحدوث. كما كتب لويس قائلا: الإله لا يبعث بالمعاجز بصورة عشوائية كأنها أتت من الفلفل الناعم، إنها تحدث في حالات عظيمة في لحظات تاريخية فارقة، ليس في التاريخ السياسي أو الاجتماعي، وإنما في التاريخ الروحي الذي لا يمكن لنا معرفته بصورة كاملة. وهنا نرى بوضوح قوة الحجة التي تقول بندرة وقوع هذه المعاجز فقط، بل ندرك أن لهذه المعاجز غاية ما، وهي ليست مجرد تعبير عن أحداث سحرية خارقة للعادة من أجل إثارة إعجابنا. إذ كان الإله هو المقتدر الخير فإنه لن يلعب دور المحتال. يناقض بالكلون هذه النقطة بقوله: لا يجب تفسير المعاجز على أنها سلوك إلهي ضد قوانين الطبيعة، فهذه القوانين هي تعبير عن إرادة الإله، وإنما عبارة عن وحي عميق لطبيعة العلاقة الإلهية مع الخلق. لتكون ذات مصداقية يجب أن تحمل المعاجز فهما أعمق من الفهم الحاصل دون وجودها. وذكر أن العالم الطبيعي بيؤمن بأقوى معجزة طبيعية، وهي معجزة تكون العالم من جزء أصغر من الذرة من خلال انفجار عظيم، وعز القوانين الفيزيائية عن تفسير هذه المعجزة. فالكون أتى من العدم ولم يكن موجود لكي يخلق نفسه بنفسه، ورغم ذلك يصدق العلم هذه المعجزة، بل ويعتبرها من أهم اكتشافاته. وقال أيضا: لمن يظن أن العلم ضد الدين وأن العالم لا ينبغي له أن يؤمن بالله، إنه لا تعارض بين العلم والدين، لأن كل منهما يكمل الآخر. هناك بعض الأسئلة الوجودية التي لا يستطيع العلم الإجابة عليها، لكن الدين يستطيع.
Science is about trying to get rigorous answers to questions about how nature works. And it's a very important process that's actually quite reliable if carried out correctly with generation of hypotheses and testing of those by accumulation of data, and then drawing conclusions that are continually revisited to be sure they're right. So if you want to answer questions about how nature works, how biology works, for instance, science is the way to get there. Scientists believe in that, and they are very troubled by a suggestion that other kinds of approaches can be taken to derive truth about nature. And some, I think, have seen faith as therefore a threat to the scientific method and therefore to be resisted. But faith in its proper perspective is really asking a different set of questions, and that's why I don't think there needs to be a conflict here. The kinds of questions that faith can help one address are more in the philosophical realm. Why are we all here? Why is there something instead of nothing? Is there a God? Isn't it clear that those aren't scientific questions and that science doesn't have much to say about them? But you either have to say, well, those are inappropriate questions and we can't discuss them, or you have to say we need something besides science to pursue some of the things that humans are curious about. For me, that makes perfect sense. But I think for many scientists, particularly for those who have seen the shrill pronouncements from extreme views that threaten what they're doing scientifically and feel, therefore, that they can't really include those thoughts into their own worldview, faith can be seen as an enemy. And similarly, on the other side, some of my scientific colleagues who are of an atheist persuasion are sometimes using science as a club over the head of believers, basically suggesting that anything that can't be reduced to a scientific question isn't important, and it just represents superstition and it should be gotten rid of. Part of the problem is, I think the extremists have occupied the stage. Those voices are the ones we hear. I think most people are actually kind of comfortable with the idea that science is a reliable way to learn about nature, but it's not the whole story. And there's a place also for religion, for faith, for theology, for philosophy. But that harmony perspective doesn't get as much attention. Nobody's as interested in harmony as they are in conflict, I'm afraid.
وبعد أن ناقش البروفيسور كل المشكلات الخاصة بالإيمان، بدأ يستسلم للأدلة القوية التي أقنعته وقادته الإيمان بالمسيح، واعترف أخيرا بقبوله الإيمان بالمسيح رب ومخلص لحياته.
Realization that there is a person in one of these faiths who has the solution to that. And that's the person of Jesus Christ, who not only claimed to know God, but to be God, and who in this amazing and incomprehensible at first, but ultimately incredibly sensible, uplifting, sacrificial act, died on the cross and then rose from the dead to provide this bridge between my imperfections and God's holiness in a way that made more sense than I ever dreamed it could. I had heard those phrases about Christ died for your sins, and I thought that was so much gibberish, and suddenly it wasn't gibberish at all. And so, 2 years after I began this journey on a hiking trip in the Cascade Mountains up in Oregon, with my mind cleared of those distractions that so often get in the way of realizing what is really true and important, I felt I had reached the point where I no longer had reasons to resist, and I didn't want to resist. I had a hunger to give in to this. And so that day, I became a Christian. That was 31 years ago.
أشكرك عزيزي المشاهد على المتابعة، وإذا أردت معرفة المزيد عن اختبار هذا العالم العظيم فاقرأ كتابه لغة الإله لكتبه هذا العالم بنفسه ومترجم للغة العربية، وهتلاقي الرابط بتاعه في صندوق الوصف. أشكرك وإلى اللقاء في الحلقة القادمة بإذن الله.